In our last episode, we witnessed the early years of a legend, a young prince who would become one of history's greatest conquerors. From his guidance under Aristotle to his ascension to the throne, Alexander's early life was marked by destiny and drama. We saw him face his first major test, where he fought rebel armies, where he proved his mettle as a king. But that was just the beginning. Now join us as we continue this epic journey of Alexander the Great, as he sets his sights on the Persian Empire and embarks on a campaign that will change the course of history forever. Alexander focused on the big task ahead of him after leaving Greece. He set off to the empire that was ripe for taking in spring in 1334 BC, where Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. Alexander's 40,000-strong army, divided into formidable sections, included 9,000 Macedonian phalangites led by Parmenion, 3,000 elite shield bearers led by Nicanor, 7,000 Greek allies, and 5,000 mercenaries, 1,000 expert javelin throwers, 1,000 archers, 4,000 Thracians and Illyrians, and a powerful cavalry force of 1,800 companion cavalry led by Philotas, Alexander's royal squadron, 1,800 Thessalian cavalry ready to take on the world. Moving forward, news had gotten to those in Asia Minor about the arrival of Alexander, who felt scared about his invasion. They had to discuss a strategy and how they could defeat him. And while discussing, a general among them advised the satraps to avoid battle with Alexander, but all was to no avail. The Achaemenid, known as King Darius III, didn't feel threatened by the arrival of Alexander. He let his satraps stop Alexander. The Persians had suggested attacking first at first light, but they were shocked by what had befallen them when Alexander had planned ahead of them by attacking immediately when they got to the river Granicus in the afternoon. Alexander, determined to defeat the Persians, formed his troops strategically. On the left, the Thessalian and Thracian cavalry under Parmenion's command. In the center, the phalanx formation was led by his trusted generals. On the right, Alexander himself with companion cavalry, javelin throwers, and archers. Outnumbered but determined, Alexander charged into battle with his army close behind him. Fight was fierce, with Alexander facing off two noble Persians, Rusaces and Spithridates. Saved by Black Clitus, Alexander turned the hands of the battle. Persians fled, begging for mercy, but Alexander's army showed no quarter. With blood rage in his eyes, Alexander conquered Granicus, a crucial victory in his campaign against the Persians. Asia Minor was now at Alexander's mercy, but he still had to conquer the Persian Empire. Persians, hearing the defeat at the river of Granicus, made them gather more men and multiply resources to face Alexander. In the spring of 333 BC, Alexander advanced into Lycia and Phrygia, then proceeded to Gordium, where he was shown the legendary Gordian knot, which had a prophecy that whoever could untie it would rule Asia. Well, Alexander took his sword and split it in half. That was smart. After leaving Gordium, Alexander led his men to Cilicia and was poised to cross the Nur Mountain into Syria. Persian army had devised a plan. King Darius III led his army to emerge to the north behind the Greek army. Darius was eager to destroy Alexander at all costs and decided to block Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal area near Issus, where the Battle of Issus began. Darius' army was up to 100,000 and had the finest soldiers around Persia and 10,000 of his household troops called the Immortals. Alexander was more than just outnumbered. He was determined and didn't feel intimidated. He ordered his army to deploy near the Paneras River, and he placed his cavalry at the wings, planning to use his infantry phalanxes armed with 18-foot Sarissa pikes to overwhelm the Persians. Even with this information, the battle wasn't looking favorable for Alexander, where his elite companion cavalry shattered the Persians and began to encircle the Greek mercenaries and threaten Darius III directly. As Darius saw he was losing the battle, he panicked and fled the battlefield on his chariot. Persian armies retreated, seeing that their king had also fled from the battlefield. Darius III had to face humiliation from Alexander. Then the Macedonians proceeded to the royal tent of the Persians. Not only did they find gold and silver, but also the king's wife, his mother, and his children, which Alexander treated well. Alexander was victorious again in the Battle of Issus. Alexander went on with his quest to subdue the western territories of the Persian Empire. In 332 BC, the coastal cities of the Phoenicians submitted to Alexander, which ended the Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. Out of the cities that submitted to Alexander, one decided to resist. It was the city of Tyre. The city was the host of the main Persian naval base and was about to be dominated. They were confident in their city and sure that it could withstand any attack. When Alexander conquered part of the western territories, he was building a causeway in 332 BC across the channel to support siege equipment. It wasn't going smoothly due to the bombardment by Tyrian missiles, which led Alexander to build high towers to protect the engineers. At this moment, Alexander was angry. He was offered a ship by the Phoenician towns of Sidon, Cyprus, and Rhodes, which helped defeating the Tyrians. The Macedonians took over Tyre and slaughtered 8,000 people, and 10,000 people were sold into slavery. They could have just surrendered when they had the chance to. His conquest continued. He took Gaza by siege, then went to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt willingly surrendered the entire territory to Alexander and the royal treasury. Now Alexander advanced to the heartland of the Persians, seeking to conquer, and a showdown in 331 BC with Darius III, who fled in the last battle. Darius heard the news of Alexander coming and decided to send a letter to Alexander offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half of the empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's victories and acclamations had convinced him he was destined to rule the world. He rejected the offer rather than accepting half of it. He was coming to take it all. Darius III had to assemble his army, Gaugamela near Modern Mosul in Iraq. The news got to Alexander. He went straight to the battleground with his army. This was the final battle between these two to stop each other. The Battle of Gaugamela happened on open ground with no river or mountains. Darius' army was about 50 to 80,000 fighters and made up of continents across the empire. The infantry from Syria and Babylonia, the cavalry from Armenia, India, and Central Asia, and even a handful of war elephants. Alexander's army has always been outnumbered, and he has always been victorious with a small army. Alexander sets his unusual formation. The Salian and Thracian cavalry commanded by Parmenion. In the center were the Macedonian veterans of the phalanx, each armed with their 18-foot sarissa pike. On the right side was Alexander with his elite cavalry, his companions, and his best infantry, the Hypaspes. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, which took the Persian army by surprise. He planned on drawing the Persian cavalry out from the center of Darius' line to counter him. The battle changed in an instant. Alexander had tricked the Persians into bad terrain, and his horsemen charged through the gap. Meanwhile, Darius knew his plan had failed badly. The Macedonian infantry moved aside, and the chariots crashed into their troops. The enemy line had shattered, and it was said that Alexander threw a spear at Darius but missed. Seeing his army falling, Darius panicked and fled the battlefield. Alexander's army stood victorious again. The end of the Achaemenid Empire and King Darius III opened a territory to India for Greek invasion and conquest. In 327 BC, Alexander summoned the local chieftains to surrender, and Ambi, ruler of Taxila, answered the call. Alexander's strategic marriage to Roxana secured critical alliances and supply routes. With his general Amyntas guarding the region, Alexander embarked on the Kopan campaign, also known as his campaign to India. His mission was to capture key fortresses in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. The battles were fierce, with Alexander and Ptolemy wounded in the fight against the Aspasians, but the Macedonians prevailed. taking city after city. The Garaeans and Assassinians fought valiantly but ultimately fell to Alexander's forces. Even the defiant Cleophas, mother of the Assassinian king, couldn't resist the siege of Massaga. Finally, Alexander claimed Aornis, his last great conquest, securing his lines of communication across the treacherous Hindu Kush. This was just the beginning of the amazing story of how Alexander started his campaign in India. Hold on tight. We're about to discover if Alexander can conquer the Indians. Will he succeed or fail in this conquest, he is embarking on? Find out next in the exciting story of Alexander.